Hiya guys, how you doing? Happy Friday. Up at the training ground this morning because Eddie Howe has just held his press conference ahead of the visit of Manchester City in the league tomorrow. There's news on transfers, further from Eddie Howe on the back of what Darren Eales said yesterday on potentially having to sell to buy thanks to FFP. And also bad news on Joe Linton, and a transfer update on Dominic Solanke, who's been linked with the club this week. So I'm going to pop out to the car and deliver you that information, but that's the intro here from the training ground. Hi again guys, as promised, little update from the car. So had a chance to digest some of what the Newcastle manager Eddie Howe was saying today, and it felt very much more of what we had heard from Darren Eales yesterday. Now, I know there'll probably be a few supporters out there, and myself maybe a little bit, thinking, well, we've heard Newcastle sort of plead poverty in the past, and then they've gone out last January and signed Anthony Gordon, Alexander Isak, after saying that they couldn't afford it. So there is a little bit of me thinking that, but I do feel, because the message is coming from all sides, and there is continuity there, that Newcastle are struggling with financial fair play. And I thought it was very telling when Eddie Howe was asked today about Dominic Solanke. He was linked with Newcastle, should I say, were linked with the player earlier this week, and Eddie Howe was clear and saying, look, Dominic Solanke is a player who we can't afford at the moment. He said, it's a frustrating story for me. He said, I love Solanke, I signed him for Bournemouth, I rate him very highly, but we haven't made an inquiry for him, and we don't have the ability to sign a player of that level. So, really strong words there. We do not have the ability to sign a player of that level. What would Solanke be worth in this market? Probably around 40-50 million pounds, and Newcastle saying that they're unable to buy a player for that sort of money right now due to financial fair play regulations. And the fact that he's saying it's a frustrating story for him, I guess, is because it kind of puts the message out there that Newcastle do have money to spend this transfer window, when, according to himself and the chief exec Darren Eales yesterday, they do not. Now, I think what we have to remember is, in all of this, and I know there's a lot of criticism towards financial fair play, and I can see exactly why, because it feels like it's stopping a club like Newcastle, who have the riches there to spend, but can't do it. So they've got everything in place in terms of the owners and the amount of backing they want to put into the club, the manager. They've got the best sporting director around, they've got Darren Eales, who's obviously a top chief executive, and all the pieces are in place, but these rules are stopping the club getting to where they want to be in the time frame they want to be. It feels as though if they are to get there, it's going to take a lot longer than it at first expected. I mean, it was really interesting to think back to when the takeover went through, and I mentioned this on my update last night on YouTube, that Amanda Staveley, the owner, said at the time that she wanted Newcastle to be winning the Premier League within 5 to 10 years' time. Well, yesterday Darren Eales told us that the plan is for the club to be a top 6 sustainable side within the next 5 to 10 years. So it's kind of changed from winning the Premier League to becoming just a top 6 side, and that is clearly down to financial fair play and the profit and sustainability rules, which again is holding Newcastle back in terms of not just signing players but also bringing revenue into the club, because they can't do the sort of deals that we've seen the likes of Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal do in the past with parties that are related to the owners of their club. So it does feel very much like there are blockades there for Newcastle, things stopping them reaching where they want to be quickly. But as Eddie Howe and both Darren Eales said yesterday, look, we knew the rules were in place before the takeover went through. The owners knew that. And I asked Eddie today if it was frustrating that the club's owners have the money and the ambition to take Newcastle to the top fairly quickly if there were no rules in place. And he admitted, yes, it is frustrating. He says it's frustration for everyone at the football club. The owners are ambitious, they would like to improve the squad, but the rules do not allow that at this moment. I don't know what to say, it's just how it is and we're acting on it as best we can. But he made it clear today that there is no money to spend in this January transfer window, or very little money, and it feels like the only money they would have would be to pay for a loan fee for someone to come in until the end of the season. As we know, there's the interest there in Calvin Phillips, but for Eddie Howe to come out on the record and say, look, we don't have the money to sign someone like Dominic Solanke, even if we had inquired for him, shows everything about where Newcastle are at right now, and they are severely hamstrung by the rules that are in play. So going back to what Darren Neal said yesterday, the club need to sell players to be able to buy, and that's because it's not because they don't have any money, as you guys will understand. It's because they need to sell to be able to generate the ability to then go out and spend again. So look, I think it's important to remember that we see that, or we have seen that with a lot of the other clubs near the top of the league. Let's take Manchester City. They've sold Zinchenko, Jesus, Sterling, Cole Palmer, Mahrez, Laporte in the last couple of years. Look at Aston Villa, Jack Grealish, 100 million, and then reinvested it in the likes of Moussa Diaby, Diego Carlos, Leon Bailey, these sorts of players. Spurs have sold Harry Kane for 100 million, and we see them spending some of that money now. They've signed the Romanian defender from Genoa. You look at Arsenal, I can't think of any big sales off the top of my head, but I think they had to push the boat out by the sounds of things to get in Declan Rice, and they are close to their financial fair play regulations and guidelines at the moment as well. Look at Chelsea. Yes, we see Chelsea bringing in player after player, and they've pushed the guidelines by giving these players 7 and 8 year deals, and I very much think that those will come back to haunt them in the future. But you can just, off the top of your head, the amount of players that have left there in recent times, even going back just a few years. Eden Hazard went for huge money to Real Madrid. Look at last summer, the likes of Pulisic, Loftus-Cheek, going to Tomori, going over and playing in Italy. I made a list, likes of Mendy, who went to the Saudi Pro League, Koulibaly. There's so many players if you go through the list. I mean, Chelsea, I think, sold about 17 players in the summer. Mason Mount to Manchester United was another one. So Chelsea are having to do it. They are obviously being a little bit cute in how they do it, but obviously there's now a blockade for them that they can't do these 8 year deals, which I think is a good thing. For Newcastle, they rightly didn't want to bring players in on 7, 8, 9 year deals. It just seems ridiculous if the player doesn't fit in at the club, and you're left with him if he's not happy. So look, I think Newcastle are doing everything you can, but I felt from Eddie Howe today, he was very open about his frustrations, and I think it's probably it's magnified more by the injury situation. It looked like that was beginning to clear up with the likes of Isak Botman, and looked like Joe Linton back from injury a couple of weeks ago. But as you'll have seen by now, Joe Linton is now being ruled out for a minimum of 6 weeks with a quad tendon injury. So picked up against Sunderland at the weekend, and I thought things were beginning to clear up for Eddie Howe, and he must be absolutely cursing his luck with these injuries. Now, I know a lot of you will be asking, well, should he be looking at the medical department? For me, it's the wear and tear on the players this season, the amount of games they've had to play with, very little recovery in between, no training. And you look at other teams, Chelsea have had the same, and they've not been in Europe. They were missing 12 matches for the game, 12 players for the game at Middlesbrough the other night. And Middlesbrough, their opponents, who are playing every 3 days, their schedule has been very similar to Newcastle's, albeit against lesser opposition. They had 12 players out injured or suspended for that game as well. So Brighton have had loads. I think they had 10 or 11 out the other week. So there are other teams who have been beset with injuries. It's not just Newcastle United. But Eddie, look, without doubt, will be cursing his luck to lose Joe Linton. I think Joe Linton against Manchester City is probably your key player in that team. So huge worry there in terms of when he's going to be back. He says they've had to pick him up because he feels really down. And then he's not been helped by the other injury situations. Anderson and Willock won't be back anytime soon. It sounds as though it's probably going to be into next month. It sounds as though Jacob Murphy is close. He's back out and running on the grass, but not doing any contact training. Perhaps he's back for the Aston Villa game in a couple of weeks' time. He says Barnes is getting closer, but then also followed up by saying, but still has a long way to go. So that one is very unclear. And it sounds as though Wilson will be back for the Aston Villa game. So Look, they're just going to have to make do with what they've got, and it feels very much like this season, unless they suddenly start all clearing up at the same time, is going to be one of those seasons where Newcastle are just going to have to muddle through, and it might actually have to be a season that they just need to kind of really write off. Yes, they've enjoyed the experiences in the Champions League and still knocking at the door in European football, but you've been up against it in terms of luck this season, and it feels like the season might begin to peter out. I feel that there was a hope that these players coming back in January would have meant that the club don't need to act, but I just felt from the way Eddie was speaking today, although there's not any money to spend, they are still going to look at the loan market. Now, yesterday, Darren Eales, the chief executive, said there's no intention to use the Saudi loan option, which I find staggering given the fact that Newcastle, were desperate for that vote not to be upheld, so that they could loan from the 4 PIF clubs in Saudi Arabia. But the information I'm hearing now is that the clubs over there don't want to deal with Newcastle unless they get a good deal. So, I mean, I've mentioned Alexander Mitrovic a couple of times. I think I spoke about him on the air the other day. Now, there's a question mark whether he could make the move anyway, due to the fact he's played for 2 clubs in the one season. But if you even disregard that, if you look at Al Hilal, they're top of the Saudi Pro League, are they going to want to just hand over one of their best players to Newcastle and pay half his wages to loan him out there? I mean, you would suggest those high up at the PIF would see an importance of one of their clubs, Al Hilal, winning the league, whereas they're probably looking at Newcastle right now, sitting 10th in the Premier League, and thinking, you know what, Alexander Mitrovic could actually do a more important job for Al Hilal than he could for Newcastle, because Newcastle obviously, as it stands, don't look like they're challenging for anything other than potentially a European place and still in the Cup. So it sounds as though the Saudi clubs aren't actually being as easy to deal with as perhaps what we thought, or many assumed they would be at the outset. Couple of other things to add in terms of transfers. He was asked about if there's been any inquiries for any of their players. He said, at the moment, nothing that I'm aware of. And then he was asked at the very end if he would have the final say on any outgoings, and he said, look, it is a team effort, but I think if it comes down to financial fair play and taking into account what happened at Everton with their points deduction and their punishment, if it came down to financial fair play, he said, I'm sure it will be taken out of my hands. So that shows that financial fair play is managing the whole situation. And Eddie Howe may not have the final say if a big club came in for one of their star assets, a Bruno Guimaraes or Alexander Isak, and like who I said on Twitter earlier, guys like Longstaff, Willock, Almiron to a lesser extent, but players who were at the club before, Lewis Miley, I suppose, another one you could include in this, Joe Linton, of course. Players who were at the club before probably didn't have a huge value because either they were in the youths or they were in the first team and not doing well, now have a value on their head. So that's work that Eddie Howe has done, developing them and improving them, and that is something that is a positive in all of this, that Newcastle do have assets there they could sell, the likes of Botman, Isak, Bruno, and then these lads who have been improved under Eddie Howe. That was not the case beforehand. So on the flip side of it, at least they do have assets, but it's just a shame, and Eddie Howe actually said that. He said it is a shame that we're having to look to sell players that we wouldn't want to sell just to try and evolve and improve the squad. But it very much does feel like it's going to be hard for Newcastle to get up there alongside the Arsenals, the Manchester Cities, the Manchester Uniteds of the world, when it takes a long time to build your revenue, and then the revenue, I would guess, comes hand in hand with players arriving, because if you're going to get big revenue and big deals, then you need to be playing in Champions League year after year. But to be playing in the Champions League, you need to be able to buy the players. So it's a bit like what came first, the chicken or the egg, and for Newcastle it feels like whichever way they turn at the moment, they're being blocked a little bit. They've pushed as hard as they can. They've exceeded expectations by qualifying for the Champions League this year and getting to the cup final, where in another day they could have won that. But it just feels as though, as I say, everywhere they turn, they're unable to get to that next step. So I could sense the frustration coming out from him. And another thing I want to mention, and it's in the headline of my piece on the thumbnail, saying we've got no friends. He was asked about the loan market and if that's something Newcastle will look to delve into in the next couple of weeks. I've touched on the fact that Darren Eales says they won't go into the Saudi market, or they're not intending to. But Eddie said, I do feel there's a lot of market value in the loan market, but I'm not too sure if there's many clubs out there that are willing to help us currently. He says to agree a loan deal, you have to come to a deal. So we are in that moment where I'm not sure we have many friends in the market. He was asked to elaborate on that, and he said if you're intelligent enough, you can work it out. I'm sure you're good enough to work that out. So you know what he's saying there is that the clubs that he'd want to loan from all see Newcastle as competition, whether they're below them in the table, above them in the table, whether clubs abroad that could be playing in Europe. And it sounds as though it's difficult for Newcastle to loan the sort of player that he wants. And the longer the season goes on, I'm of the belief that Calvin Phillips will have a decent chance of coming to Newcastle if he hasn't gone to Juve or elsewhere already, because look, Newcastle obviously have an interest in the player. It sounds as though Pep Guardiola and Man City want to help the player because he's not played him in a year and a half. And look, Phillips will want to make sure he's playing at a decent level so that he could get called up for England for the Euros in the summer. So I just feel the longer the window goes on, there is a chance of that happening. But obviously it would have to be something that Manchester City agree with. And I just feel, you know, with the days ticking on, I think they would try and help the player because, you know, it's not been a nice situation for him. I think the only worry Newcastle have got is if another club comes in and agrees something before then, because I'm not sure whether Phillips will want to leave it until the very end of the window, knowing that he's probably not going to play between now and the end of the season if he stays. So look, I frustrated Eddie Howe today. Darren Eales wasn't quite as frustrated yesterday. He was probably a bit more pragmatic at the situation, but I think when Eddie Howe's dealing with what he is on the training pitch at the moment, so few players to select from, he would love a bit of help, but it sounds as though he's been blocked a bit by FFP and he's also been blocked a bit by other clubs not really wanting to loan his players. So look, things can change, and he says he is still in the market for players, and although nothing's happening right now, it doesn't mean it won't happen later on in the window. And we know Newcastle have, you know, dealt out these smoke screens before. It felt a bit more real this morning, and it feels like it's something that's sort of itching away at them and causing a problem, and is really stopping them getting to the level they want to. Of course, as I say, everyone knew that beforehand, but once you get to this stage, it must be frustrating for them when they've reached this now and they don't know where they turn to get to the next level. So look, it's ridiculous we're talking about this when Manchester City are coming to town to visit tomorrow, but it's just the latest in a long line of really hard games for Newcastle that's kind of made them realise exactly where they are at the moment, and not helped by the injury situation. So it's a situation where obviously everyone's going to have to get used to, and I can sense there's a lot of frustration coming out of you guys as supporters right now, as there is from Eddie Howe at the moment. But you know, I think the good thing, the positive thing, the way to look at it is, although you are going to have to sell a player or players at some stage, you know that with these owners they are going to plough the money back into the playing squad, whereas under the previous owner that wouldn't have happened. It would have just gone into the bank. So at least you know that the club are doing things on the pitch in good faith. Just one final piece of news, if you've got this far in my video, it's that Erling Haaland is out for the match tomorrow. It's in James's Park, which will be a boost for Newcastle, because obviously he's a really huge player for them, and a tough player for Newcastle to go up against for that defence to handle. So that'll be a boost for them. Joe Linton out for Newcastle, Haaland out for Manchester City, probably the two most physical players in that matchup. So that's all from me just now, guys. Please leave a message below, give us a thumbs up, please subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll speak to you after the Man City game. Cheers.